All right, the ordained time has come. Looking at the title, just in case you're worried you stumbled into the wrong lecture, I want to assure you that I will talk about mid-century modernism. I'll actually help you understand it a little better. I'll even give you a new context for thinking about the exhibit upstairs. But I want to warn you before we get started here, mostly in between the slides and the stories, I'm going to give you a lecture about aesthetics. I'm even going to talk about Immanuel Kant. So if you want to leave and ask for your money back, I won't be offended. I just want you to know what you're in for. I'll also even introduce myself eventually here, but to really get started, I want to actually first tell you a story about retail that unfolds in the last half of the 20th century. Let's see if we get this thing to work. And of course, there's got to be a bug. There's always a bug. It says it's working. There we go. In 1918, a young man was born in the middle of the boondocks and in the middle of the Depression and had an aspiration. He had an aspiration to help his family out. And he was just a young kid, but he realized he could do chores and help out, and he really got fixated on the idea of earning income. And eventually, he goes on to get into the retail business. He ends up owning a chain of stores, but that's not what he's famous for. He's actually famous for establishing a store that we're all familiar with, Walmart. In 1962, he opened this store. Maybe it was 1952. Actually, yeah, 1962. He opened the very first Walmart. Now, he already had a successful chain of stores, but he had this idea that by cutting costs out, by cutting out the middleman, by being highly discounted, he could actually build a different kind of store. His second innovation was that he thought instead of building stores where there were lots of people, he would build stores where there weren't a lot of people. So, of course, Walmart began in the 50s destroying the mom and pop stores across America. Now, I want to point out something because we're in a museum and we're talking about design. This is really bad design. I'm not really. I think that Sam Walton's idea of saving money started at the very beginning. I mean, this is actually so epically bad that it's actually entertaining. But I actually don't want to talk about Walmart. I mean, I get the same feelings you may have about Walmart. I mean, it may represent low cost, but it really doesn't represent quality or design or anything that we might want to think about today. So let me tell you another story. This story starts 8 years later. It happens, there's good old Walmart. It happens 8 years later, 1926. Same story, really. A young man's born, not a lot of money, not a lot of opportunity. Becomes fixated with making money really early on. As the lore goes, he started buying matches in bulk and selling them at a markup. And he realized that, he understood marginal economics really early on. This young man went on to found another important retail chain, but his was focused on something else. His was, of course, focused on furniture. This is Ingvar, let's just call him the guy that started IKEA. I'm not a scholar of IKEA, I just find IKEA super fascinating, as we'll get to. He actually innovated a couple of really interesting things along the way with IKEA. Much like Sam Walton, he was obsessed with price. So he drove price down on everything. He cut out the middleman, he built his own supply chains. So very much the same story of Walmart. Super low prices. But what he did that was different, he actually was interested in design, and the other thing is he invented the flat pack. IKEA invented flat pack furniture. So before IKEA, buying furniture was kind of an investment in a lifetime. After IKEA, people would actually shop and they would look and they would decide to take this home and they would just put it on their car and take it home. So he really innovated this idea of furniture as consumption. But as I mentioned, he was very interested in the idea of selling an experience from the very beginning. This is 1951. He started IKEA in 1943 when he was 17 years old as a traveling salesman and then eventually as a catalog company. This is before the store actually existed. First catalog. You can kind of see the glimmer of some design, but let me show you. I want to walk you through from 1951 to 1962 when Walmart opens. I just want to give you a little story in terms of IKEA catalogs. This was the 1952 catalog. Pretty cool, pretty hip. Here we got 53, 54, 55, and 56. Now remember, this guy's obsessed with saving money. He wasn't just like going and finding the fanciest design firm he could find. He just actually thought about the experience of what he was selling to people. Here we go. What do you got? 57, 58, 59. And then I just went ahead and jumped ahead. Here's 62. Again, there's really kind of a sense of design, even early on in IKEA, that the furniture is becoming more contemporary and kind of obsessed with the modern aesthetic. The design is very contemporary. I got to read you a quote, 'cause this is a great quote. This is from a curator at a museum. And she says this about IKEA catalogs. She says, this is, let me find it here. Here we go. This is from Romana Rebelman. She's an art historian and curator of fine art and design and graphic art and posters at the Museum of Applied Arts in Cologne, which, by the way, has a collection of IKEA catalogs. She says, these catalogs don't just show furniture, but whole worlds, different ways of life. Incidentally, the Art Museum and Library of Cologne also has a collection of IKEA catalogs, proving they're not junk. Because if they're in a museum, they're not junk. So I want to compare 1962 IKEA catalog to 1962 grand opening Walmart, and just to sort of emphasize that there's something going on with IKEA that's different from Walmart. Under the covers, they're concerned with the same thing, eliminating cost, delivering the product to the customer at the lowest possible cost. But somewhere IKEA and Walmart parted ways. Now, for me to explain that to you, let me tell you a little bit about myself. It turns out, you guys know who this is, right? This is Jake Jabs, right? I'm not obsessed with furniture. I'm obsessed with fun. And Jake Jabs is the most fun furniture dealer in Colorado, right? He's got lions and tigers, and he's a goofball. And I mean, we love Jake Jabs. He's been a character in South Park. So when I get a chance to take my picture with Jake Jabs, it's not about furniture, it's about playfulness. Because in fact, why I'm here today talking to you is I am a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. I actually am in the architecture department, although I'm not an architect, and what I study is fun. I am the professor of fun. I dedicate myself to understanding what fun is, how it works, why we like it, and how it operates in terms of the things that we make and the experiences that we have. Because I'm the professor of fun, I get to do things like this. I get to take a big, giant, massive detour on a trip to Chicago to go to Hastings, Kansas, to go to the birthplace of Kool-Aid. I do this so you don't have to, because that's all there is. It really isn't worth it. So you can say my enterprising research around fun has already paid off with a little travel tip. Also, just kind of incidentally, I was once an attraction at the Denver County Fair, so I'm willing to get out there. But back to IKEA. I'm obsessed with IKEA. I find IKEA is this fascinating firm, and I've used IKEA to kind of frame up what I want to talk about in terms of the aesthetic of the Serious Play exhibit by pointing this out. The big difference between IKEA and Walmart, in my opinion, is IKEA is fun, which I will get into, and Walmart is not fun. So if you're with me now, you can kind of understand my perspective on this, and I'm going to continue to use IKEA as kind of a metaphor for what's actually going on with the aesthetic of play that I'm going to get into. But let me tell you a little bit about IKEA and why I'm so fascinated by IKEA. I recognized a long time ago that IKEA delivers experiences in the same way that Disneyland does. They actually operate on a similar aesthetic principle. They're trying to sell you an experience that's different than what you actually have. And I got another quote for you, because I wrote about this in the past. And anyone recognize this? Yeah, this is the IKEA map, as if you need a map. You're just going to follow the trail through, right? And to my mind, the trail through IKEA, and by the way, IKEA has been focused since its very first store on delivering an experience, of giving people a sense of traveling through exhibitions. So if this looks like the museum to our map to a museum, it's not incidental. It's because IKEA is designed like a museum to deliver you experiences. The difference between IKEA and a museum is in IKEA, you can sit on the exhibits. You can imagine yourself in each one of these tableaus. Now, I recognized over time that I started to say, you know what, IKEA reminds me of something. I spent 20 years writing about games and video games, and I was like, oh, I realized what IKEA reminded me of. IKEA reminds me of an adventure game like Dungeons and Dragons. And if you're not familiar with the form, this would be a dungeon map that someone might explore with the help of a dungeon master, and you'd go through and you'd try to adventure and achieve something. And I want to read you a really interesting quote from a friend of mine. He's a game scholar and a game designer. He wrote about adventure games. So if you're not familiar with adventure games, this is what Ernest has to say about adventure games. He says, although the genre has changed considerably over the years, the games are characterized by certain qualities. Okay? They all share exploration, collection, manipulations of objects, puzzle solving, and a reduced emphasis on combat and action elements. Now, if you've been to IKEA during the holidays, you know there's still an emphasis on combat and action elements. But the rest of the time, IKEA really is this exploration. You're exploring this domestic dungeon, and you're thinking to yourself, wow, wouldn't I be a great entertainer if I had this dining room? Wouldn't I be an amazing chef if I had this kitchen? Wouldn't my children be organized if they just had this room? And in fact, you're in this fantasy world where you're exploring and collecting, and IKEA makes it very easy to collect. The puzzle solving comes when you go home and you try to put the furniture together. What's also interesting about what Ernest has to say about adventure games is he says this. He says, the player wants to avoid the drudgery of everyday life and enjoy him or herself in another place entirely. In the place of these kinds of games, why would the player choose a role in which she found herself emulating her own real life? Now, I look at this and I've realized, and I will go back to IKEA again and again, because to me, IKEA is this wonderful adventure. It's this chance to imagine I'm organized, I'm good looking, I have interesting friends, my children are brilliant, all the things that we all aspire to. And the path is not incidental. It avoids you being able to see through things. It makes you kind of face each tableau separately and consider it and kind of get excited about it. And then you eat, and then you go downstairs, and then there's all the stuff to buy, to harvest, to collect, to take home the loot that you've earned on your adventure. Now, for me, what's interesting here isn't the fact that IKEA is an adventure game or adventure games are like shopping, as much as they have a similar aesthetic. Your mindset when you go into IKEA is very different than the mindset you have when you go into Walmart or Target or most other department stores. Because IKEA actually has absorbed something in this play aesthetic, which will kind of unravel over the next hour. So let's play a little game, because I want to tie IKEA back to the Serious Play exhibit, and I can't think of a more fun way than to test your knowledge of the exhibit upstairs and/or your knowledge of IKEA. Okay, so we're going to play a game. I'm going to show you an image, and you have to guess whether it's IKEA or whether it comes from upstairs, okay? It's harder to look. So, here we've got, the one on the left is from the exhibit upstairs, or Isley, right? That's just some pillows at IKEA, okay? By the way, as a quick footnote, did you know that IKEA products all have proper nouns? And the nouns actually aren't arbitrary. It turns out the guy, Ingvar Kamprad, he just had trouble remembering inventory numbers. Go figure. So he started naming things after nouns. So I can look it up, but it's basically like beds are named after Norwegian towns or Norwegian words. Regular furniture is named after Finnish words. Household goods are named after like Danish, adjectives. So there's kind of actually a system to it. It's not nearly as arbitrary. And what's also interesting is those names actually are used globally across the 160-odd international stores IKEA has. All right, so here we go. Ready to play? Okay. Okay, ready? This is ready. This is IKEA, right? Okay. Okay, IKEA or Serious Play? It's hard to tell, but yeah, that's IKEA. Okay? Yeah, it's IKEA. Sorry. How about this one? Yeah, it's a shower curtain from IKEA, I think. Okay, how about this one? Yeah, it's hard. It's IKEA. So, okay, how about this one? There you go. You got one, right? Okay. So, Serious Play. Yeah, the closer the detail, the harder it is to tell. It's an IKEA pillow. Are you sure the Eames didn't design this? Nope, it's IKEA. Yeah, this is from some of the Gerard stuff. Yeah, of course that's IKEA. As I mentioned, the very first store opened, he promised hot buns and tea, so there was hot buns and tea, and ever since then he realized that people don't want to buy on an empty stomach. So food and shopping have gone together because, again, Kamprad always thought about the experience of shopping, never just the products. His delivering design to the people was about the experience. So it's interesting to me that IKEA and the Serious Play exhibit have this kind of symmetry, this harmony. And, one could just say, oh, well, he's got good taste. He absorbed, great lessons from the great mid-century designers. And I think that that's true. And we'll talk more about IKEA toward the end, but I also think that IKEA has become sort of a laboratory for what happens to those designs that we basically have under glass upstairs, when people actually can buy them. People still want to buy this stuff. So the playfulness of the mid-century didn't go away. It's just at IKEA. And in fact, I'd like to kind of expand the scope a little bit because the exhibit upstairs is fantastic. I mean, it really is wonderful. But it's somewhat limited because it focuses on a subset of very important designers. If you know anything about kind of mid-century America, it developed this whole genre of this kind of kitschy Americana. And what happened in Southern California was the core of this. And the answers to why it happened was, well, it was the end of World War II. America was extremely affluent. We had destroyed industrial manufacturing from the rest of the world. So, of course, everybody had to buy from us. We were rich. We were optimistic. And we decided to go insane and basically just get crazy and embody what I'm going to start telling you is this aesthetic of play or this aesthetic of fun. So like right here in 1959, the Shasta trailer, right? You can see it's all cut off, I'm sorry. It's got fins on the back. It's insane. But, America hit the road. I mean, there's precedent for motorhomes that are much older, but all of a sudden Americans wanted to get out in their cars and go camping in these cool things. This is just an example of some sort of like googie space age modernism. It's the Southgate Mall. I think it was 1956 in Florida. And the guy that built it, he was a grocery store guy, and he built this mall, and he thought, well, I'll build this giant, fancy entrance and it's one of the first malls. Just this idea that you could use architecture and this kind of really fun, playful stuff to attract people in. I mean, this is the era of tiki bars. This is the era of, this is the era of Disney. This is the era of people wanting to get out and play. In fact, Americans in particular really wanted to have a good time. I mean, the 50s were just marked by this abundance of playfulness. And it's not too far to say that it was also doing some other things. 1953, this is when this magazine comes up. So there's a context around serious play, which is the entire country was actually feeling pretty optimistic, and designers were reflecting that. And what we got to start to understand is like, well, how did this kind of come into design? How did this come into mainstream? And then how does IKEA still kind of hang on to it? And I'm going to stitch all that together over the next, the rest of this talk. And I wanted to also point out that, the mid-century obsession carries with us to today. Here's a picture of three people that, they're alcoholics, they're womanizers, they're cheats, they're liars. But mostly you're thinking, I wonder if they sell that cart at IKEA. I just want to kind of emphasize that, what's wonderful to me about mid-century design in general is that it really does embody something that's a little bit timeless. We see it as kitsch at times, but then when it gets sold back to us sometimes, it's really exciting to us. And I promise by the end of this, I'll give you a reason why. But I guess I'll give you the reason now that I think about it. I study fun, F-U-N, fun. I studied the concept, I studied the word, and I can tell you more about fun than you want to know. But I figure I need to tell you a little bit about this kind of theoretical construct of fun, because I'm eventually going to tell you that fun is this aesthetic understanding. And I'll get to that, so just bear with me. But first, I just want to say, like, what's fun? What is this fun thing? Because we kind of tend to think it's a throwaway word like cool or awesome. But really, fun is a much more precise word. It's actually something that we know well, and we use it in a very intentional way. So bear with me for 10 minutes as I be the professor and I lecture you on the theory of fun. But first, a question. What are these people doing? What's that? Well, they're deaf. It does not apparently appear they're having fun. What about these people? Yeah, they're terrified, I would say. Wait, what are these guys doing? Trying to get away from something. Now, if you're not familiar with the haunted house world, these people paid probably between $30 and $40 for the privilege of looking like this. And in fact, what they are doing is having fun. So I always like to show these slides and sort of say, if I can explain to you why this is fun, then maybe you'll believe me when I talk about fun in general. Because it turns out that haunted houses are a particular style or approach to how people have fun. And so let me get into that. So the theory piece, and I'll keep this brief, and it includes monkeys, so I think, that's fair. Theory, brief, monkeys. Yes, I'll do that. There was a Berkeley professor who had Gregory Bateson. And Bateson did a lot of things. He was married to Margaret Mead, among other things, but he was interested in language, he was interested in culture, he was interested in biology. He wrote about a lot of stuff, but one day, as a kind of a, an intellectual might do, he woke up one day and decided to ask himself the question, I wonder if animals have metacommunication. And so metacommunication is just communication about communication. So we all know this, especially if you have a spouse. It's like, you come home and you say, what do you want for dinner? And it's like, anything's fine, And somehow that's not actually read as anything's fine. That's like anything's fine but what you actually made, right? Because that's metacommunication. It's communication about communication. So we're all very familiar with the idea that sometimes the words carry one set of meanings, but we mean something else with the same words. And Bateson just wanted to know if animals had the ability to have metacommunication. So, since he was a researcher, he went to the zoo, and he sat down, and he's watching the monkeys playing, goofing around in the monkey cage. And he sees them, they're running at each other, they're attacking each other, they're biting each other, but they're not really biting each other, right? They're pretending to bite each other. They're biting, but they're not really biting. And he goes, oh, first of all, yes, animals have metacommunication because these monkeys are biting each other in a way that says, I'm biting you, but not in a way that means we're really fighting. I'm biting you in a way that's not a real bite. So he's like, great, metacommunication. Kind of set that aside. He says, but what I really discovered is that this is the origin of fantasy and play. So he wrote this really important paper called The Origin of Fantasy and Play, and he came to the conclusion that this construction, which he called the bite that's not a bite, is the origin of fantasy and play. Or this metacommunication that happens, even in animals, certainly happens in people, is what we start to think of as play. And what he was saying is, the monkeys want to play in a way that is like they're fighting. And they want to say, this bite is meant to represent a real bite. I want you to think of it as a real bite, but don't actually bite me back because I'm not really biting you, so we're not really fighting. And so that's the fantasy, and that's the play. And so this construction of a bite that's not a bite then sort of starts to say, oh, this is a way of understanding the world that certainly we have, but even animals have it. And if you extract that or abstract it a little bit and you talk about this is not condition, things that both are and are not what they say they are, you actually now understand the core insight into what we mean by fun. Now, this is hard on us because we are taught in our world that's not the way things work. We are deeply steeped in British empiricism, and we believe that things are black or white, they're right or wrong, they're left or right, they're Republican or Democrat. And so this idea that they're kind of both sort of in different contexts, depending on which way you look at it and squint real hard, is really hard the first time you hear it. But it's easier if I give you some examples. So let me walk you through a bunch of examples, just really quickly, to kind of demonstrate the kinds of things that we collectively might think of as fun actually all adhere to this is not construction. And by the way, that's why haunted houses are fun, right? If I put you in a building with an axe-wielding maniac, that wouldn't be fun. It would still look like that, but it wouldn't be fun. But if you go to a haunted house with a pretend axe-wielding maniac who's the bite that's not a bite, I'm an axe-wielding maniac who's not an axe-wielding maniac, you can embody the fear in a safe way. Now, people that don't like haunted houses like me can't do that dissociation. It's all is. I don't care that that's fake. It looks real to me. I'm terrified. But that's why the is not such a powerful concept, is because actually when you see it working, it works really well, depending on kind of how you think about it. But let's look at some examples. Oh, wait, I'm not to my examples yet. Well, I'll come back to my examples. Let me just explain, before I go into the examples, this is kind of out of order. This isn't just Bateson's idea. This is not. I mean, Bateson kind of found his flavor of it. It turns out there's a ton of people that have written over many, many years trying to understand what we think of is the meaning of play. And just really quickly, this guy, Brian Sutton Smith, the scholar of play, he thinks that play is an important adaptation that we need evolutionarily. This guy, Arthur Kessler, wrote about this idea of bisociation, which I'd love to go into, but his basic idea is that humor, scientific discovery, and artistic creativity were all a part of the same kind of is-not construction that he called bisociation. If you read the Serious Play book or any of the introductory material up there, you'll see Hunziker and Kaloy were both referenced. They both say that play is this fundamental driver of culture. Hunziker in particular would tell you that play is the thing that drives all culture, that like the seriousness comes after the play. I would like to point to this fella here, Erasmus, the great Middle Ages scholar. He was a biblical scholar, and he wrote a book called In Praise of Folly, which, not to put too fine a point on it, but he embodies folly, and then folly dresses down a bunch of people that says, you think you're so serious, you wouldn't be anywhere without me. And so that was in the 1500s. So we've been on this game for a long time. But I like Bateson's construction because it's kind of the easiest to think about. So let's look at some examples. All right. Games are a wonderful textbook example because all games are, a certain sense, they're packaged little machines to deliver fun. And so if you think about what Monopoly is, I mean, what's Monopoly about? It's about destroying the financial futures of your friends and family, right? It's not even just making them poor, making them impoverished, taking everything from them. And it's actually a lot of fun, you know. It's money that's not money. It's real estate that's not real estate. It's poverty that's not poverty. And so we enjoy these kinds of games, but you think about them narratively, they're kind of horrible, you know. But as long as the is not, it can be fun. As someone who studies a lot about space and architecture, you know, I love Disneyland. Disneyland's this amazing place that's filled with a mouse that's not a mouse. It's got a house that's not a house. Castles that aren't castles. Mountains that aren't mountains. Or the best thing example, the Jungle Cruise. It's a river cruise that goes in a circle. Rivers don't go in circles. That's not how they work. That's sort of not the definition of a river. But we go along with it. And I think sometimes people that don't like Disneyland will say, I don't like Disneyland because it's fake. People that like Disneyland go, I know it's fake. That's why I like it. It's also real. It's real and it's fake, right? It's both at the same time. So we'll come back to Disneyland, but theme parks are a wonderful example. Architectural folly, something I study quite a bit. This is the Long Island Duck, a classic folly. It's a building that's not a building. You know, the building doesn't have to be built like that, but it's built like that because it's fun. Puzzles are wonderful. You know, puzzles are this intellectual labor that we commit for no good reason, only to finish them and throw them back in the box. But puzzles are, you know, they're puzzles in a sense that aren't puzzles. They're intellectual labor that doesn't matter. I love terrariums and fish tanks, nature that's not nature. Somehow we take these live animals and we put plastic plants and little plastic pirate ships in there, and somehow that makes us feel better. You know, it's a very strange thing to do, but it's fun because it's is not. It's nature that's not nature. Toys are wonderful. I mean, children. I think if you have children, you're around children, you understand that children don't like toys because they're small versions of what adults have. They like them because they're small versions of what adults have that aren't quite the same thing. So kid doesn't want the mower that the parents use to mow the lawn or the oven that parents use to bake in. They want a little mower that's safe, and they want a little oven that's safe because they want to enjoy playing at the thing, not doing the thing. And you get older, then you want to get closer and closer to the real thing. But toys are always these kind of representative objects that children understand aren't the real thing. They're obsessed with the is not, the meta-communication that goes on in the is not as we are. They just express it maybe a little less elegantly. Costumes are wonderful. Eggs and bacon that aren't eggs and bacon. Any costume is that sense of I'm pretending, I'm playing at being something that I am not. And then magic, I'll just throw magic up here. I read a lot about magic. It's a fascinating subject to me because, you know, in this day and age, nobody thinks anybody has psychic powers, the ability to materialize objects or pass material through material. We don't believe any of that. So when I show it to you, you know that it's a trick. You know that it's fake. So I'm showing you something that you know is fake, but that you accept as real. So it's like magic is this wonderful interstitial place where your brain and your perceptions are in collision, and it's fun because that's the is not construction. So this is just kind of a quick kind of walk through the idea of fun, and I like to use the term the is not because I think it's a helpful way of just keeping it in your mind, that whenever you're looking at something, it kind of has to serve both functions at the same time. And one of the things that's really important about the is not construction is when it collapses in one direction or the other, the fun's over. If I'm play fighting with you and I actually hit you, the is overtakes the is not. The play goes away, right? And if you take away too much of the is not's no fun. Then it just becomes, like if you go to Disneyland and you think it's all real, I'm not a psychologist, but I think that's called psychosis. So you really have to maintain both things at the same time, and it's a delicate state to manage. It's why play can collapse so quickly. It's why something can be delightful and then it can go away. It's probably also why a night of drinking is fun. The next day you kind of wake up and you're like, maybe that wasn't as much fun as I thought it was. So that kind of gets you to where I want to get in terms of actually talking to you about aesthetics. And this last year, this book came out. It was written by myself and a friend of mine, John Sharp. John's a design and game design professor at Parsons out in New York. And John and I were bonded over a common interest in the idea of what makes games fun, or what makes games better than other things. Excuse me, should I say one more time? What makes one game better than another? We wanted to actually understand the underlying aesthetics of games. And we both study a lot with video games. Now, John's an art historian, so he studied Middle Ages art. So, you know, he was very clear on the idea, the functions of art, the aesthetics of art, kind of how we use aesthetic frameworks to gauge art, what's good art, what's bad art, what belongs in the museum, what doesn't. And we looked at games, and games at the time were under a lot of pressure to act like art. And so there was a big push to be like, games should be in museum, video games are just like art. But we loved art, and we kind of understood the aesthetic background of art, and we were like, that doesn't make any sense with games because there's something else afoot. So what we did is we worked out this model to try to actually comprehend what makes games different from more traditional forms of art. And you know, the title is this really amazingly creative title, explains it to you. We realized that fun is the core aesthetic. Now, before I can talk to you more about fun and go back to the is not, I told you we were going to talk about Immanuel Kant. Now, you can't do aesthetics in the West without talking about Kant, because in some measure, there really wasn't an aesthetic theory in any comprehensive or widely accepted way until there was Kant. And Kant's aesthetics really, in a nutshell, is just this idea of beauty. He talks about the beautiful and the sublime, but there were a couple of properties of his aesthetic. It was, you know, and they revolved a lot around, to not get into too much detail, but that art, beautiful art, had to be kind of like purposeless. It couldn't be serving a purpose. It just had to serve its own purpose, just so you would marvel in nature. You'd marvel in the beauty of God's creation. And so he also said you had to have a certain level of disinterest, which was similar. So he was kind of like, you know, a pair of boots couldn't be beautiful because boots had a purpose. But a painting could be beautiful because it didn't serve any other purpose other than to be beautiful and show its beauty. And, you know, and Kant had this kind of interesting, complex theory on the other side about how philosophy works. So beauty is this kind of idea that he has, and it really predates what we think of now as fine arts. And so fine arts really starts to gel around this idea of purposelessness and beauty. And that's really how our art aesthetics and our museums and the functions of art really go forward, which is awesome and amazing. And, you know, and people have critiqued Kant. I'm not trying to get into that. I'm just trying to say at the end of the day, what we think of as art, we usually adhere to some form of the beauty aesthetic. Now, I know people don't like aesthetics because aesthetics sounds like what it looks like. And if it's what it looks like, oh, it's just beauty's in the eye of the beholder, or I don't like aesthetics because it's just so much mumbo jumbo. Either, you know, it speaks to me or it doesn't. When John and I talk about aesthetics, we kind of embody all of that and say aesthetics is our kind of intellectual way of understanding that relationship we have with our objects, with our experiences. And beauty is a primary way that we understand the world. What we figured out with our framework, though, was that beauty is not the only aesthetic. It's the primary aesthetic operating in the arts, but it's not the only one. There's another one. And so I love this quote by the art historian Ernest Gombrich, and he says, you know, the idea of fun is even more unpopular among us than the notion of beauty. So he's pointing to two things at once. He's pointing to the fact that, like, we love beauty, we just hate talking about it. And two, we like fun, but we don't even want to admit it, right? A quick side note, this is really peculiar to kind of the American culture. You know, the American culture really gets founded by these, you know, religious exiles, the Pilgrims, right? But there's a lost history that there's other than this other side. There was another colony at the time that Plymouth Rock was founded called Marymount, and these people were basically anarchists. They made alcohol, they made friends with the Indians, they intermarried with the Indians, they didn't have stockades. They prospered until they got too drunk one day and Miles Standish and his army went and took all their stuff, and that was the end of that. But America's always had this sort of split kind of personality. On one hand, we're Puritans, and on the other hand, we're just kind of crazy. And there's a great book about this called American Fun, written by an English professor at Annapolis. It's a great book, and it kind of outlines this. But I think this quote's really interesting because Gombrich, I think he was German or Austrian, he lived in England. he even identifies early on that this idea of playfulness or fun is something that we're uncomfortable with. We tend to leave it at the door of childhood. But in fact, it's not something that we leave behind. It's something that we embody. So what I want to do for the remainder of the talk here is I want to actually start taking this idea of fun in the is not construction, detail it out a little bit more so you can have a better understanding with it, and apply it not only to games and architecture, but eventually to the designed objects. Before I do that, I want to point something out which might be a little non-obvious, which is how is it that our designers get into art museums? Because I just said, our notion of beauty is it's disinterested, that it's purposeful purposelessness. And clearly, if you design a chair like this Girard chair, it's got a purpose, right? Well, I have a kind of a theory here, is that designers historically go through a fine arts preparation. So they actually get through all the beauty aesthetic stuff. They learn how to make beautiful things. But for whatever reason, they're dissatisfied with creating useless objects, useless, quote unquote, right? Things that are only good for the soul. They want to make stuff that you can use. So I think between the idea of a chair that's just built entirely to be utilitarian and the idea of fine art, something that's just meant to be admired or understood as beautiful, you end up with things that can kind of go right in the middle, like this Girard chair, which is, it combines some beauty and it also combines some function, and it looks comfortable, but it also looks interesting. Or you can get to this chair, which doesn't even look like a chair. I mean, it's almost back to sculpture. It's playful, but I think that the reason that you're going to start to find that our designers are in museums is because they're so good at the beauty aesthetic. They also got good at the more technical aspects of deploying products that people could use. And my theory here is, and I'm not going to hammer this much more than this slide, is to say, I think this is why you find, particularly in the mid-century, there were a lot of designers who were ready to play because they'd already escaped the gravity of the beauty aesthetic. They already were breaking the rules. They were already making beautiful chairs and beautiful, room dividers and beautiful shelves. I mean, they were already doing that stuff. So the idea of making it fun probably didn't seem that weird because they already were outside the fine art establishment to a degree. Okay, so this is where I'm going to turn from kind of this theory of fun into actually an aesthetics model. So again, just to kind of keep it kind of shorthand, John and I think about aesthetics, and there's a lot of different definitions of aesthetics. We think about aesthetics as a system of understanding of how you approach your experience. So you could kind of just say it's the philosophy of experience in a certain sense. And the philosophy of the beauty aesthetic is established, and it's interesting, and it's worth exploring, and it's got 250 years of wonderful, confusing literature that you can spend the rest of your life trying to make heads or tail out of. John and I just thought, well, we'll just start a whole new strain of aesthetic theory, and we'll call it fun, the fun, taste, and games model. And this is the model. I'm gonna go through it in some detail here so that you can kind of see all the pieces and parts. But the part I want to just kind of orient you on here is, remember, we were building the model on the notion of games, so we put games in the middle. And then we said the top half of the model were these fun atoms. These are the parts of the aesthetic model that speak to the fun of a thing. And the bottom part of the model is taste. And I haven't talked about taste yet, but taste is a part of the experience, the aesthetic experience, like what you like. And so those are the bottom atoms. So I'm going to go through all this in pieces so you can understand it and put some clarity into it. But what's important to me here is just to point out to you is that what we realized by the time we finished writing the book is we really hadn't written an aesthetics of games. We'd written an aesthetics of play. So it's pretty easy to transpose game for object. And we could even say experiences. We tend to frame our experiences in the arts in terms of objects. And even if the object's in a performance, the performance happens in a place, it happens by people. So I'm just going to use the word object as a shorthand here. But to say that this fun object model, fun taste and object model works just as well. It's the same basic theory. And then to do a little cleanup here, I take out play, and I'll just change that to taste. So we talk about taste communities, taste style. So when you see play or games, just understand that's a little bit of the artifact of us writing to a specific audience. But as we've worked on this model further, we really have come to think of it as a kind of a more largely formed notion of how we understand playful experiences. So You can imagine where I'm going to go with serious play. I'm going to give you a way of thinking about that exhibit that balances both aesthetics of beauty and aesthetics of play, which another footnote. Play and aesthetics they're like twin brother and sister. They're related, but they're not identical. They fight, but sometimes they come to dinner together. I don't want you to think that I'm suggesting to you for a moment that play should exterminate beauty, nor any more than beauty exterminates play, although beauty tries to get rid of play all the time. But that playful little sister in that twin dyad is very, very tenacious, and she returns time and time again. So let's just break it down and give you some examples. I'm big on examples. So these are the atoms of fun. These are those top 3 atoms. Set outsideness, ambiguity, and ludic form. And in the middle, you find fun. So what we would say is it takes these 3 concepts to really form the notion of fun. And I know you're going, wait, you just told me is not was fun. I go, that's just an easy way of thinking about it. This is the aesthetic model. That's what you define fun as. This is the aesthetic model. So let's do each piece in part and then think about them. Ludic form, first of all, ludus is the Latin term or word for play. And in my world, we don't use English words if a good Latin word will substitute. So we use ludic form, and I think it's a good cocktail party word, ludic form. Ludic form in games, most easily said, it's the rules, right? It's just like you get the box out and you read the rules, and that's the rules of the game. It gets a little dicier when you get to computer games, because computer games, there's no rules necessarily to read. It's in the code, so the code sort of are the rules. I think this illustration of a tennis court can also help illustrate ludic form, right? Because it's multiples. In part, ludic form is how high is the net, how wide is the court, how deep is the court, what can the surface of the court be made. There's also the ludic form of actually a tennis court. When you go there, I mean, it has material properties. You can't hit the ball through the net. You can try, you just can't do it. I mean, so that's part of the design of the ludic form. So ludic forms, in a certain sense, are just the rules, but I have a different way of talking about ludic form when I teach it in architecture. Is I say ludic form is any kind of formal arrangement that invites play. And so I love this illustration of a slide because if you think about it, a slide is a simple machine, right? It's one of the simple machines. It's a very efficient way to move things up and down, with the least expensive energy, right? That's what an inclined plane does. But if you put a ladder on the other end of an inclined plane, it is a pointless machine, right? You climb up it to go down. You expend energy just to come down. But yet we understand intimately what this is, because this ludic form invites playfulness. It invites us to go up, to go down, until we get bored, then we try to go up the wrong way, right? And so I just think it's kind of an essential idea to think about. Ludic form isn't just rules. Ludic form is any kind of a structure, and it can be as as ephemeral as rules that we speak out loud. It can be as material as something that has been designed. But it does invite play. And whether it's intentional play like this, where you actually want to get on it, sometimes it's just visually inviting your mind to play, to understand it, to contemplate it, to think about it. That's kind of why I think IKEA is so interesting in a certain sense, because these displays invite your mind to play, and then you go sit on the couch. So ludic form is interesting. It's just these formal mechanisms that we design in order to facilitate play or fun. Ambiguity is the next one. Now, ambiguity we use because the is not construction is just hard to say. But the is not construction really is this notion of ambiguity that we're talking about. If I tell you something both is and is not what it is, I have already insisted on you a certain kind of ambiguity. We pull out ambiguity as a concept because it's pretty important in terms of how we think about fun and play, for a couple of reasons. The first is that in terms of playfulness, if you think about play, the word in English has this wonderful double meaning. On one hand, it means child's play. It means, hey, we're going to go out and be childlike and just enjoy the world. But there's also a notion of play meaning like mechanically a looseness. It's not broken, it's just there's play in the system. It moves a little bit. And so we think of ambiguity as being that playfulness, that ability to make meaning. And it's really super important in playfulness, because if it's both is a bite and not a bite, I am constantly engaged in meaning making. Are you biting me? Are we playing? Are we not playing? If I dress up as a police officer and I go out on Halloween and I'm a police officer, that's not very ambiguous. I'm just going to work. But if I dress up as a policeman on Halloween and I pretend to be a police officer, you're negotiating. To what degree does David want me to pretend that he's a police officer? To what degree is he just being, silly? If I go out and impersonate a police officer, the ambiguity's gone again. So it's really important that in this play aesthetic, in this fun, there's constant meaning making going on. And I'll give an example of this diagram here, or this picture in a second. There's another reason why ambiguity is so important to this model. It's because beauty despises ambiguity. This is the aesthetic of beauty. Either you get it or you don't. You don't like opera, there's something wrong with you. You don't understand why that painter is amazing, there's something wrong with you. And if you just stood there long enough or with enough education, you would finally understand it. This is the beauty aesthetic. And I'm not really opposed to this. I love beauty. This is a power to it. But beauty is meant to be absorbed. It's standing on a cliff watching the waves roll in as the sun goes down, this sublime notion of beauty, the power of nature. There's nothing there for you to negotiate. It's only to wash over you. Ambiguity in fun, no. There's no such thing as certain fun. Fun is always contingent. It's always in making of meaning. You're always negotiating meaning. So this is why fun and the beauty aesthetic are very different. Now let me give you an example from video games. If you're a video game player, this will look very familiar to you. If you're not, this just looks weird. This is a game called Grand Theft Auto 3 Vice City. The purpose of this game is to play this guy who's a criminal and basically kill everyone you find and take their stuff. I mean, that's the nature of the game. It's actually an incredibly artful game. There's an amazing social commentary about the American experience. But it's also kind of weird. I mean, here's a guy running around with a gun. SWAT team's chasing him. You can see dead bodies in the background. And the violent video game conversation usually pins on these kinds of discussions. And I find this a very interesting place to talk about ambiguity, because the people that don't like video games look at this and they're like, that's really horrible. Why would you want to embody and play a criminal and hurt people? That's just terrible. And the players that play this game, what do they say invariably? It's just a game. It's not real. And it turns out they're both right, but they're both wrong. Because the ambiguity clause would suggest it has to be both. I mean, the joy of playing a violent video game is the violence. But if the violence is contradicted by the it's not real violence, and you can be in that meaning-making space, then it's cool. If you use a game like this to ignite hatred, to ignite real violence, then there's no is not. This is just an ugly piece of media. And you'll see this over and over again. It doesn't matter if it's a sports game or a driving game or a shooting game or a puzzle game. When people get addicted to video games, it's a real thing. The is not's gone away. It's just become a compulsive cycle where someone's going through and trying to find a way to feed that feeling. But you can play the same game. You can play poker and it can just be fun, and you can set limits and you can enjoy it because there's an ambiguity there. So I could say too much about ambiguity, but you probably say, well, you already have. So I'm going to move on. But the key things to take away from ambiguity, this is where the is not lives. This is really the major distinction between the fun aesthetic and the beauty aesthetic. And this is also incredibly important that in that moment, you're always meaning making. And when the meaning making ends, the fun is basically over. All right, one more, set outsideness. This is the closest to Kant's clause for, being disinterested, right? That there's something going on in play that's different from regular real life. And we chose this notion of set outsideness, which is borrowed from a bunch of places. But the idea here is, if you see two guys hitting each other in the face on the street, that's called a fight, and you call 911. If you see the same two gentlemen in this Luddic arena doing the exact same thing, it's the most brutal sport, or the most beautiful brutal sport. I don't remember. I'm not a boxing fan. But realize the context matters because it's set outside. And the rink, the court, the pitch, the field, these are really important constructs in sports. And all sports have notions of what's acceptable on the field and off the field. They all do. And there's usually major penalties for doing things off the field that are perfectly allowable on the field. These boxers are allowed to hit each other as hard as they possibly can. There. If they do it outside, disqualification. Set outsideness is important because it's a part of how we play. It's partly how we protect the ambiguity, right? It's by saying we're not in reality right now, it's okay. But we are in reality. So it would say, like, for example, Halloween. It's a great day to dress up in costumes. I can be a pirate on Halloween. If I go to work on November 1st dressed as a pirate, somehow the fun starts to collapse, at least for the people around me. So set outsideness is a really important concept because it just basically says we do deliberately set things outside in order to treat them as a special case. So you put those three atoms together, Ludic form, set outsideness, and ambiguity, and when you see all those things operating together, and you can also see how they work together, and then sometimes they kind of compete with each other, you get this idea, this aesthetic of fun. So let me go to the second part of the model, and I'll put it all together. Give yourself credit. You have just swum through the deepest, most shark-infested waters of this talk. This part's easy. Taste is really important. Beauty is most certainly not in the eye of the beholder, but beauty is most certainly informed by your own personal taste. I love the term taste because when we talk about food, it's easy to understand what taste means. I can say, I like pickles, and you can say, I don't like pickles, and I don't say, there's something morally wrong with you, pickles are amazing. We're just like, okay, fine, I like pickles. You know what you're missing. Pickles are awesome. So taste is really important, and taste actually interoperates with any aesthetic model. And you find aesthetic models that eliminate taste, it's usually an authoritarian move. We don't make that move. So there's three parts to the taste model. And we also realize taste floats in culture. Like your taste is affected by the culture that you live in. So let's just look at it real quick. So play communities, who do you like to play with, right? I mean, maybe you like to play with the poker friends. Maybe you're a competitive soccer player. You like to play on a competitive team. Maybe you like board game night with your nerd friends. Maybe you like, to play, bridge with your bridge club. It doesn't matter. Play communities are just who you like to play with. And it's not a moral judgment. It's a taste thing. It's just, I like these people. I like the way they play. They play like I do. Play style is how you like to play. So let's take poker, for example. You can play poker high stakes competitively. You can play poker for low stakes. You can play poker for M&Ms. You can play poker with plastic chips. You kind of get to decide what your style of play is. Any kind of a game, you can play aggressive. You can play, more conservative. You can play in a joking style. You can play in a serious style. I like this. This is these like Societies for Creative Anachronism. It's clearly a play style. They're very invested in, they're not on their play community, but also the style of play. It's not satisfactory to just play Dungeons & Dragons. They want to live it out. And then finally, play genre. There's just genres of games, right? And we tend to adhere to different types of genres. I like card games. I like board games. I like sports. I like outdoor sports. I like winter sports, right? I like competitive games. I like cooperative games. So genre is just a way that we actually collect taste signals that we can share across play styles and play communities. And it becomes a way of kind of starting to define and understand ourselves. We know genre because genre is actually one of the most popular ways we think about style is because we tend to define like, I like romantic comedies, I like Japanese food. We always are using this genre to help define our taste signals. So let's put it all together and I can show you how it all kind of works. So we talked a little bit about Monopoly. When you got the whole model functioning, now you can really actually have this really rich aesthetic conversation about probably one of the worst board games ever designed. It takes too long to play. It's boring. Once your dad or your uncle or your sister starts to win, you just have to sit there and wait for them to kill you. It's so it's not a very good game in a sense, but everybody's got it, right? So it's a very, very popular game. So when you look at the whole model, this is why it's important to look at all the pieces and parts. So, we talked about the ambiguity. There's ambiguity inside of Monopoly. It's like, we get to make the meaning. Does it mean something that I took all your property? Have I really hurt your feelings? Are we just playing at that? Did I really make you cry? Oh, I really made you cry. I'm sorry. The Ludic form, the board that goes around, the fake money, the rolling of the dice, the picking of the things. And these aren't incidental things. I mean, families have probably dissolved into chaos over who got to play the doggy or the shoe, right? So there's all Ludic form things, and I don't think Monopoly's clear on how to assign that. The set outsideness, I mean, again, Monopoly's kind of contained. You open the box, you sit on the kitchen table. There's a moment that you play Monopoly. There's probably someone that does this, but I don't know anybody that just leaves Monopoly out to just be casually played as you walk by. It's not that kind of game. It's a kind of game that really has its own kind of boundary once the box comes out. And then here's the taste, the play community. I mean, if you play Monopoly, you probably play it with your family. That's probably the community that you play this game with. The play style is, maybe you just play for fun. Maybe you don't even care. You just like eating chips and hanging out with your friends and family. So maybe your play style is really casual. Or maybe you're a shark that's actually got some sort of dice, statistics formula, and you're trying to figure out what to buy based on some derivative formula. I don't know. But there's different kinds of ways to play Monopoly. And then finally, genre. Monopoly fits inside of a genre of these kinds of family-friendly board games. And so some people are going to say, I don't like Monopoly, right? Now they're going to say, I don't like Monopoly because the Ludic form is broken, right? They're going to say that. I don't like Monopoly. It's not a balanced game. And that's fine. They can say that because those atoms interoperate. Or, they can say that I don't like Monopoly because I kind of know how the game works. It's not ambiguous to me anymore. It's just a chore. It's kind of like playing Monopoly is like playing tic-tac-toe with a 4-year-old. Fun for the 4-year-old. It's boring to you because there's no ambiguity in it, right? So you can see how these atoms all kind of interoperate. Now you can start to understand things like house rules, where we start to say, like, let's make the game more interesting. Let's break some of the rules. Let's change up the Ludic form. Let's give the youngest kid extra money, or let's divide the properties up at the beginning so that we can play the game more quickly. So you can start to see how, your play style, your play community can start making decisions to affect the ambiguity, to affect the Ludic form. And this is why the model is helpful in starting to unpack and understand our experiences of these fun things. I wanted to talk a little bit about Disneyland because I just love talking about Disneyland. But you see, there's this fun taste in architecture now. You bet. I just taught a class this summer called The Architecture of Fun. And basically applying the fun taste in games model to architecture. And so Disney works the same way. Like the Ludic form, all these kind of, these set pieces, they're set like movie sets, all the rides, all the way the park is organized, its themes. There's so much formal stuff in there. Even look at this castle, these turrets, these brightly colored flags, the crenellations. All this is in this weird, wacky scale that Disney does. The ground floors are full size, and it's like foreshortened as it goes up, making these buildings look bigger. All kinds of Ludic form. The ambiguity is there. It's a castle that's not a castle, right? It's a Disneyland. It's a land that's not a land. It's filled with all the stuff that is what it is not. And if you like Disneyland, the entire time you're there, your mind's going crazy because it's like, it's all there. It's all material. It's just none of it's what it is. It's all kind of contradicting itself. Set outsideness is wonderful because as you go under the berm into Disneyland, you go through a portal on either side. Does anybody know what the plaque above it says? This was from the very beginning. This plaque says, "Here you leave today and enter the world of yesterday, today, and tomorrow." See, Disney didn't need the FTG model to figure this out. He set Disneyland outside. He built a 12-foot berm around the park to try to keep Anaheim out. The set outsideness is so deliberate. It's done through Ludic form. It's done in this ambiguous way, but it's very, very clearly set outside so that you can come into Disneyland and not be disturbed by the world outside. And then again, we have our taste, community, style, and genre. This genre of, theme park is not everybody's taste. Some people would rather go to Vegas. Some people would rather sit on the beach. Some people would rather stay home. The style. How do you do Disneyland? I got to do all the rides. I just want to enjoy walking around. There's a couple of things I really want to do. I want to dress up as a character and pretend that I am a part of this. And then finally, the community. You don't go to Disneyland with people that don't like Disneyland unless you really, you're a missionary, a Disney missionary or something. But generally, you would collect people and go to Disneyland with people that like Disneyland because that community is so essential and important. So again, I'm not going to dig into this too much more, but the idea here is that we have a model that applies to architecture as well as to games. Okay, it only took me an hour to actually get to the exhibit, but now you know something, and so we can break some of this down and do something interesting with it. If there's an aesthetics of fun or an aesthetics of play, however you want to talk about it, if that aesthetics of play interoperates, sometimes conflicts with the aesthetic of beauty, I cannot think of a better place in this museum at the moment to explore the intersection of beauty and play more than this exhibit. And some of this material that's been written about it kind of starts down that way, talking about the importance of play from Kaloy and Hunziga, but doesn't really have the aesthetic framework. And here's why, is because play and fun has sort of been a suppressed topic for the last 150 years. There's not a lot been written about it outside of children and childhood. So it's really hard for serious art critics and scholars of art and museum curators to intersect play. So in a certain sense, serious play is a wonderful exhibit because there's a braveness to it. There's a bravery in it, in actually just saying, hey, this stuff actually is here and it's playful and we want to find the joy in it. So I just kind of cherry-picked some things to sort of show you how the same FTG model works very well in recontextualizing what's going on in serious play. And you can go back up to the exhibit and do this all afternoon, all by yourself. So here we go, the same three atoms, right? Set outsideness, ambiguity, and Ludic form. So they're here. So here we have this lamp. And I just picked this one out, not because it was one of the more exemplary pieces, but there's something ambiguous going on in this lamp. I mean, when you first look at it, you first have to figure out, I think it's a lamp, right? Or maybe it's a piece of sculpture. And then you're kind of like, well, that's kind of clever that its stand is its shade, and its shade is its stand. And, you know, it invites a kind of a dialogue. The object invites a dialogue. It doesn't just say, I am a beautiful lamp, you know, adore me. It's playful. And I don't know about you, but the first thing I want to do is see if it moves. I want to grab it. I want to see if that shade rotates. I want to see if I can, you know. So there's just something about it that just demands participation. And again, but it's still beautiful. I don't want to say that the fun took away the beauty. It's still a very interesting and elegant piece. Or how about this? Talk about Ludic form. This is Ludic form. And again, it's got the ambiguity built into it. Is it really a couch? Would that really be comfortable to sit on? But it's Ludic form. What's my definition of Ludic form? It's some formal organization that invites play. They should have made one of these that you can sit on, because it's like, I've seen people stand there just trying to get their head around, I want to sit on that. How much trouble will I get on if I sit on that? I mean, you know, and I realize, you know, you can say, oh, Harper was playing with form, and he was deconstructing the couch, and he was exploring different materials. And I'm like, that's probably all true. But I'll tell you what, if you put this couch and 50 other couches in a gymnasium, and you let 10 children into that room, they would go straight to that couch. Because they're not afraid to say, that looks like fun. The marshmallow couch looks like fun. It was designed with perfected Ludic form around play. And then finally, set outsideness. Now, set outsideness is interesting in a museum context because you kind of already set outside. But one of my most joyful pet peeves in a museum is there's stuff that you want to touch and they make a sign that says, do not touch. I'm like, why do you put that there if you don't want me to touch it, right? I noticed when I went to the exhibit that the single busiest spot besides the gift shop was the toy table, right? The top table. Well, tops they're Ludic form, you know, it's ambiguous, like what they're for, I mean, all that. But more than anything, inside the museum, we set outside a space where we said, it's okay to play. And it just draws people in. It draws children in. It draws adults in. And it's wonderful. And I mean, not only does it kind of help elaborate some of the Eames's concerns and interests in toys and tops, it's just a place to play. And I think the set outsideness is doubly reinforced because everywhere else it says, do not touch. So set outsideness is really important. And by the way, if you're me and you study a lot of this, some of my favorite museums are like the City Museum in St. Louis, which is in a certain sense not quite a museum because they don't have any do not touch. They don't even have a do not kill yourself sign. And I think you actually could if you weren't careful there. It's an amazing place. So set outsideness is sort of there. Let's look through the taste atoms real quick vis-a-vis a design exhibition. Community, you know, who do you art with, you know? And I just picked this picture. I thought it was funny from some sort of 50s debutantes. But I don't think we realize in terms of the arts how much community enforces our taste. Because, you know, I would never go to a grungy exhibit in that part of town with those people. Now, you'd never say that, but that's how you feel. And likewise, it's like, you know, I have not gone to an art opening because I'm like, I don't know, I'm in shorts and flip-flops. I don't want to feel like an idiot, right? So the community enforces standards of like how you art, how you experience art, how you go about the exhibitions. And so I would just think about who you hang out with because your community is defining your taste in a certain sense. Style. Hey, now we're in home turf for you know, kind of art theory. I mean, a portrait's a portrait, right? They're all the same, whatever. No, there's different styles, there's different approaches to the subject matter. And our taste then generally is, it's pickles or not pickles, right? Whether you like Picasso or whether you like Da Vinci is really an issue of taste on one level, right? It's just a matter of just like how it hits you, what you like. And if you go to an art museum, you hear lots of times people are saying, I like this, I don't like that, right? They're actually, and a lot of times they're responding more to style than anything. And then finally, genre. Again, remember I said we group things into genres. The very fact that serious play can exist as an exhibition of mid-century, you know, full stop, we have a genre of mid-century design, which is pretty well understood. It may not be tightly bounded, but we kind of get when we look at this that, oh, these aren't even all artifacts by the same designer, sets of designers, but it doesn't matter because we all perceive it as mid-century, and it's cool because it's like we like that genre, right? We're delighted by mid-century design. So the model kind of hangs tough, and then when you put it all together, we can do the same walkthrough. So this is the Noguchi playground design that then they built upstairs, which is really cool. But let's look at it. Like ambiguity. I love the ambiguity in this thing because what's it for? I mean, you almost have to be told that it's a piece of playground equipment. And if you don't have the sign that says "Do not climb" on it, it still doesn't quite invite you in as playground equipment. So we'll get to Luddic form in a second, but it's very ambiguous. And also, if you look, it's kind of hard to see if you look there, but look, it's got these pipe fitting seams, which is awesome, because now it's a pipe that's not a pipe. It's just plumbing that goes in a circle, right? It suggests that it's industrial somehow, but it's non-industrial. So it's kind of just inviting you to be like, what is this? Is it to be looked at? Is it meant to be played with? Luddic form is interesting. In terms of set outside, if you put this in a playground, people know what to do with it. I noticed in the museum they're not quite sure what to do with it. It looks too much like a sculpture. Plus, from a Luddic form standpoint, it's really awkward to get on and off of. If you're little, it's too tall. If you're big, it just looks like you'll break something. But it still has a Luddic form, right? It's low in places. It still kind of invites you to at least touch it. I just think that there's something kind of inherently weak in terms of its Luddic form because it's too sculptural. And then the set outside, this is important, right? If you pick this up and you put it out in the courtyard, people will climb on it. Because in fact, they would just be delighted to climb on it because now it's like, well, it's out here, I must be able to climb on it. Unless it's like the big dustpan and the big broom. And what does it have a big sign on it? It says, "Do not touch," which I'm like, why is it there if you can't touch it? It's a perfectly touchable thing. So, taste, style, and genre. Again, we're into this community of taste. So we're starting to think about like, oh, I like things like this. I like Noguchi. I like big, public sculpture. Style. I like this kind of, ambiguous, abstract form. Genre. I like the genre of kind of mid-century, I don't know, playground equipment. There's a lot of this stuff. So you can go through it and you can continue to do this. And even just in this very short period of time, you can see I'm doing this sort of like I'm critiquing this piece. But I'm not talking too much about beauty. I'm really talking about how does it respond to the play registers. And I'd say this is an okay piece. It's a pretty good piece. I mean, it definitely invites a certain amount of playfulness. It's not the strongest piece in there. I mean, the strongest pieces are probably the things that you're not allowed to touch, right? The do-nothing machines or some of the chairs you just want to sit in. You just want to see what it feels like. You want to turn it over, see if it's heavy. Certainly all the toys and the puzzles and the games. And I realized some of that was out for us to touch and play with. But I just sort of look at this in terms of the fun, taste, and games model and say, there's nothing defective about this to my mind from the beauty aesthetic. It's beautiful. It's interesting. It makes me think, do I get it? How should I understand this? But from the play aesthetic, when I engage the play model, now I have to think more carefully about it. Now I have to actually think about what it means to me, how I want to interact with it. And even this, it invites you to redesign it. Playfulness always does that. You're like, well, I don't know, maybe you should paint it purple, or maybe they should put stairs on it. I don't know, I think you should have a saddle on it. Like your mind's going crazy all the time. That's not really what you see when you look at, Rembrandt's David. You're not like going, what would make that statue better? Is a pair of boots. So this comes close to bringing us to full circle, and I have a few kind of things to help wrap this up. But now you can start to understand my interest, if not obsession, with IKEA. IKEA fits into this play register really well. It struggles on the beauty register, right? I mean, it's a big, giant store with meatballs and, some of the individual pieces can be quite elegant and maybe even beautiful, although they're made out of like sawdust and spit. I don't know what they actually make things out of. But IKEA works great in terms of the play aesthetic. And I just picked a couple of examples here, and I'm sorry that's cut off. But the ambiguity. I mean, look at these. These are like they're hooks for dog leashes or something. They're little dog butts. They're kind of ambiguous. Is it for a dog leash? Is it just sort of a playful thing? Or, do I need this? Do I want this? You kind of engage in this. Here's just one of the many. One of the many sets that they have in IKEA. That, you can kind of see all the modernism, expressing itself. But it's more kind of like, oh, wow, yeah, that'd be great for my summer sunroom. And it kind of invites a kind of an ambiguity of like, again, do I need this? Do I want this? What would this be like in my house? Do I have that many friends? I mean, you kind of go through all this dialogue with yourself. In terms of the Luddic form, a little less of this because this stuff is sort of subtly Luddic. It's subtly playful, but look at the color of the chairs. I mean, they put these brightly colored chairs with this brightly colored light fixture with this really white table. The white table kind of invites your own kind of, design. It's your piece of paper that you're going to design your beautiful table settings on. And it really does have a little bit of playfulness in it. The dog butts clearly have a Luttock form, right? They could have had the dog's head, but a butt's funny, so let's just use a dog butt. The set outsideness too, IKEA is like Disney. They might as well have a plaque over it that says, you're now leaving the world of today and entering the world of your wildest dreams and hopes for only $9.99. Community style and genre, once again, I think there's people that just they like to go to IKEA. They enjoy shopping together. Just to let you know, I think when they opened a store in Hong Kong, they had a problem that teenagers were hanging out at IKEA. They were sitting at the tables all day. They were, hanging out on the couches because they just brought their community to IKEA because it was they understood the theme park aspects of IKEA. The style again, IKEA certainly has a little bit of folk style to it, but it continues to mainstream kind of this mid-century kind of design. We think of it as Scandinavian design, but I think in context of any mid-century, it's just really playing on a lot of the mid-century elements. And then again, the genre, I guess IKEA now is its own genre. Now, I want to say something about IKEA, and I'm making fun of them, but is important about IKEA. I think that if you look at the Serious Play exhibition, you can kind of get the idea that you're old enough to own some of this and you still have it, or you're too poor to afford these classic pieces. All you can do now is afford knockoffs, and that somehow we've bottled mid-century. Mid-century is for other people, mid-century is for collectors, mid-century is for people that get it. But I think IKEA really contradicts that, and IKEA says, well, the playfulness that's in mid-century, if you kind of follow along, I'm just arguing that the dominant aesthetic of the mid-century design wasn't beauty. The dominant aesthetic of the mid-century was play. It was fun. It was exuberance. It was exhilarating. IKEA actually has bottled up that playfulness, that enthusiasm, that excitement, that you can own your own home. You can do whatever you want. You can collect your own artifacts. You can express your own identity. You don't have to have it given to you by somebody else. You don't have to inherit grandma's furniture set because it's made out of oak and it's going to last 1,000 years. You can buy your own shit. You can knock yourself out, right? IKEA is really about the mid-century aesthetic of playfulness, of openness, of getting away from certainty into ambiguity, of starting to re-understand our world. And that's exciting to me about IKEA because I think IKEA, whether it's your style of furniture or it's your place to shop, really is a laboratory for the play aesthetic, particularly around design. And that's important to me because there's something in the Serious Play exhibit which isn't obvious, but it's pretty oppressive. The Serious Play exhibit is an exhibition of white men. I know Ray Eames, sure, she got to go along for the ride. I know Ting. I get there were some people that were there, but by and large, if you look at it, it's dominated by white men, and even in the photographs, the men are standing in front of the women. I'll tell you something else. There's not a lot of people of color. I know you can talk about Noguchi and Ray Mori, the guy that did the masks. Do you know both of those gentlemen were in internment camps during World War II? We can honor them as amazing designers, which they were, but they were oppressed in their time. Any other people of color in the exhibit? I saw one. There's a black waiter in the Braniff Lounge. Go look, he's standing in there. So I look at that and I'm kind of like, wow, there really is kind of we want the Jetsons, the gleaming, the future, the egalitarian, but the 50s weren't really that. The 50s really suppressed a lot of voices. It left a lot of people out. The number of women designers that are up there is limited in comparison, surely, to their skill and talent. So I flash back to IKEA as being IKEA. Oh, here's this little bottle of the joy of the mid-century, the play aesthetic put into force. And what's cool about IKEA is IKEA actually is a pretty modern company. There are 160 stores across the world. They're in places like China. They're in India. They're in Eastern Europe. They're in the Middle East. There was an exhibition that came to the United States a few years ago, 17 Swedish designers. It might be a little hard to see, but those 17 designers are all women. There's 17 women designers that work for IKEA. If you shop at IKEA, they have little bios of some of the designers, and you'll see they're not diverse necessarily, but at least they got men and women designing for them. I mean, they're honoring the fact that like their women designers are as important as their male designers. And I love this little ad here too. This was from a UK ad campaign, but this is the face of the new IKEA. It's a gay couple. So I would say my cool play aesthetic, my mid-century aesthetic, I'll align with IKEA any day because it's accessible, it's open. To the certain extent that a global company can be egalitarian, it's egalitarian. Ingvar Kamprar's notion was designed for the people, and so I think he really did treat the world as an open place. And so I think that company embodies that. So there's something to be said as you think back to Walmart and you think back to IKEA. One of these companies has embodied the play aesthetic and become, I think, a more interesting, a more open, and a more positive company. The other one has a kind of a dark cloud around it, is basically just being the place you buy cheap stuff. Now, lest you think I'm done, I have just a couple of kind of observations and I'll open up for questions. The first is that I do believe that there's a power of the play aesthetic. And I think when you channel it through the mid-century modern version of that play aesthetic, which, by the way, is not the only one. I give a whole other lecture just on playful architecture in general. But if you look at the play aesthetic or the fun aesthetic embodied in the mid-century design, you start to realize how important mid-century is to us. And this is just locally, right? I don't know how many of you have been following this debate, but the owner of this Googie-inspired diner on Colfax wants to sell it for millions of dollars so they can tear it down and build apartments. And this is like his legacy. Like he wants to sell it and just cash out and be done. Well, now everyone's fighting because they want to keep it. I don't know if you've been to Tom's Diner. There's nothing extraordinary about Tom's Diner. I mean, like, trust me, like, there's not a loss to the world except for this building, right? And I'm not even saying this is the best example of Googie architecture we even have in Colorado. But there's a fight to the death over this building. And it's not because it's beautiful. It's because it's fun. And I think that we need to be very careful to discard the beauty or discard the fun aesthetic because, well, it's just whatever. It was neat in the Serious Play exhibit. I think Serious Play is our peek under the tent of the power of play. And I'll tell you that it's important to people. So I'll leave you with this. This is my kind of closing bit because what I'm most interested in isn't design, it's not art, it's not even necessarily fun. It's the power of the play aesthetic. It's really the power of this to do something in our culture. And to get you there, I just want to read a quote from this book. It's called The Playful Path. It was written by a guy named Bernie DeKoven. John and I dedicated our book to Bernie, and he passed from cancer right before the book was published, which it's kind of tough. But Bernie's believed in the power of play. And so I just want to read just one quote out of his book because I think it's an incredibly powerful quote. And I think that this should have been the epigram that sits on the Serious Play exhibit. And it still could because what's upstairs mirrors what he has to say here. We have been taught to distrust play. Worse, we have been taught that we are not and should not be playful. We have been taught that play is childish, immature, destructive, taught by people who have themselves lost the playful path, who were themselves taught by people who believed that fun was, can you believe this, sinful. Taught by people who have inherited a broke culture where common sense has been replaced by common senselessness. Taught that if we work hard enough and long enough and live in a life that's dull enough, we will be rewarded when fun is the reward. I think that that's pretty much embodies what the things that people like the Eameses were trying to say about the power of play, about the power of playfulness. It doesn't take away seriousness, it doesn't take away beauty, but we're kind of left a little bit limping if we just leave play at the door. So with that, there's 2 microphones on the side. If you have questions, I would invite them, or comments too, so thanks. Do you want to use the microphone or you just want to yell?
I'll just yell.
Okay.
You're a professor of architecture. Is there any architecture that's fun in Denver? So when you're teaching a course, are you using any buildings in this town?
Every time I teach this course, I take everybody to Casa Bonita.
Okay, but students start out in architecture because they want to be creative and they want to do whatever. And then you have the price per square foot.
Yeah.
And how do you incorporate great buildings?
Yeah, so I would look at it again as an aesthetic consideration, right? So first of all, I have also in the past taken my class to Stapleton because you don't see it until you look for it. But Stapleton is a bizarre collage that belongs in Disneyland. It's just like, Here's Harry Potter's house. I think Frank Lloyd Wright designed that one. Here's a Spanish ranch. I mean, it's a polyglot of style, right? Now, I don't find that offensive at all. I just see the play aesthetic at work. I see people want to embody an experience that's a little bit outside of just, I want to live in another, Denver Square. There's a quick story I can tell you of a game designer that I'd interviewed in the past, and he and his brother built these houses, and I can't remember what it was back east somewhere, same house, and he borrowed extra money to build some turret in his house and some grotto and all this crazy stuff, and the bank actually wouldn't even loan him the money. I think he had to pay for it out of pocket. When they moved to Austin, they both sold their houses. He sold his house for 30% more than his brother. Because it turns out that the aesthetic investment in playfulness was noticeable to people. They really invited that. So when I teach architecture students, I say, hey, you can do whatever you want, but if you want your house to be more fun, put a trapdoor in it, put a secret door in it, or just put any running water inside of a building is naturally fun, because architects usually try to keep the water on the outside. That's why Casa Bonita has a 30-foot waterfall in it, because that's amazing and it's fun. So it's a challenge, but the reason I call it aesthetic is because I can't say everyone should have fun at every turn. I'm just saying, hey, in architecture, there's plenty of examples of it that's outside of leisure. Everybody has these places at home. How many of you have like a rumpus room that's themed after the Broncos or whatever? We build these little playful moments in our own lives, or I have a little garden or a train set. We all do it. We just deny it. And so we set it aside vigorously sometimes. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the entire architecture of fun in 30 seconds.
Denver.
Well, downtown Denver, it struggles. So we struggle with the beauty aesthetic, so let's not even talk about fun. So, any other thoughts or comments? Mostly I'd invite you to review the exhibit through the lens of play. Just, it's beautiful. It's all beautiful. But look at the lens of play. I think you'll be surprised at the power of the playfulness that those designers put into those objects. So, yes?
I'm from California, so I'm not familiar with the Tom's Diner program going on. Can you elaborate a little more, please?
It's basically a diner that was built, it's probably built in the 60s, and I think it's been, I'm not sure, but it's been the same owner for a long time. And the guy wants to retire, and he wants to sell the entire building for, I don't know, like $3 or $4 or $5 million to a developer. There's already a deal, and then in the 11th hour, people have come in and got historic landmark designation for it, and they want to keep the building. And this guy's like, I worked my whole life, I want to cash out. I want to buy a houseboat or whatever he wants to do. And the cities and the people in the city are like, no, Tom's is an icon. And I think that the conversation gets to be this historical conversation. But to my eye, people are responding to this piece of playful architecture because to the left of it ain't playful, to the right of it ain't playful. You can drive down about a mile to Bastion's restaurant, and you can find actually an even better example of the same kind of googie architecture inside and outside. But no one's trying to tear Bastion's down, so no one's talking about it. So, yeah, sure. It's worth going by.
I wish Aki had been one of my professors. I probably would have stayed in architecture.
Oh, try to make some architects fun. Any other thoughts or questions or? Oh, sure.
I guess I'm trying to figure out what's left in my mind, how your ideas, the exhibition, the century modern, relates to the later architecture like Michael Graves, Robert Venturi,
Oh, okay.
Brown. I mean, their buildings are in many ways. I mean, Michael Graves was picked to do one of the Disney hotels.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they're related in some way that I can't quite get my head around.
So she's asking kind of how architecture past mid-century had kind of, connects with this. And the answer is a lot of the experimental architecture that happened is, again, intuitively channeling this playfulness, right? And so I'm going to give you an example that I think is kind of illustrative. It's in the book. So when they were building the Hamilton wing, right, this building we're in, I was walking with my two of my kids, and they were little at the time, and I didn't think much of it. I was a stuffy architect. I don't know. It's just architecture student. I thought this is not good architecture. And the boys started jumping up and down. They saw the building, and they started literally jumping up and down. They were so excited by the form. And I was like, wow, like maybe I missed something, right? So I don't know, a year or two later it opens, and I say to them both, I say, hey, do you guys want to go to that cool extension on the art museum? And they're like, oh, maybe. And the littler one says, does it have slides inside? And I said, nah, it's just a regular building on the inside. And he said, nah, I don't want to go. So I think that, you know, even this building kind of has this ability to, like, it starts to gesture towards play, but, you know, Libeskind kind of pulls back into the beauty aesthetic. And so I think it's a very interesting building, but, you know, it contradicts some of its beautifulness, and it kind of contradicts some of its playfulness. And so it sits in this interesting sort of space. You see a lot of this with Geary's work, right? I mean, Geary's work, you know, you got to decide at the beginning, oh, I'm a high-minded architecture person, and I like it because it's high-minded architecture. Or most people are like, well, that building's pretty cool. You know, they respond to the playfulness of the form. And so I think that architecture struggles a little bit with that, because architects are trained very heavily in the classics. They're trained very heavily in the aesthetics of beauty, you know. And I think because of that, so when I teach my architecture students, I say, it's great you know how to do that. Please don't build ugly buildings, but there's an opportunity to build some play into them. And so it's unresolved and unreconciled, but I don't know of any case where it's like those designers were consuming mid-century design to get where they are. I mean, Googie's the closest thing to it, right? The Lautner buildings. You know, these guys, some of these guys were doing really interesting work, but they were intentionally being playful. You know, they were trying to express the exuberance. The terminal building at LAX, I mean, it's just beautiful, sprawling. It was designed to look insane. You know, Saarinen's TWA terminal, it was designed to look futuristic and out of this world, you know. So I mean, there's people that have been doing it intentionally, but a lot of times it's like you're getting a lot of money. It's like, just build one like the other one, you know. So it's not a clear answer. I guess that's why I just remind you, there's a beauty aesthetic and there's a play aesthetic, and they're the two predominant aesthetics in our culture at work today. One of them is popular. One of them is sort of, it's like, I don't know, it's a little bit anarchistic, right? Demands negotiation. It wants to make up its own mind about things. And so you can imagine how people with a lot of money feel about that. Like, I know, I want you to build something that makes me look cool. I don't want you to build something that's ambiguous, but.
So how do you feel about buildings that are, say, kind of standard, but then they take artful graffiti and make it their own, make it its own different building?
I mean, I mean, put it this way. So you're asking the question, like, what do you take when you take a beautiful building and you do something different with it? It depends. I mean, if the difference makes it ugly and doesn't compensate by making it more playful, then it's just an ugly building, you know. If you take something that is kind of non-standard and you do something with it that's kind of inviting, then you end up with something that can be really extraordinary. And so, I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's hard because of the culture generally considers play to be a part of entertainment and leisure. So Disney can build, so if you look at the Disney building, it's this cool Michael Graves building, and it's got these caryatids, which are the 7 dwarfs holding up the roof, right? So it's, you know, it's classic Graves. Hey, I read a bunch of history books. I'm going to play with history. And, you know, it's a cool building. I mean, it's interesting in and of its own right, and it's very authentic to the Disney company. But I don't know why other people don't just make crazy caryatids and atlases holding up roofs, because people will be like, oh, that building's pretty cool. You see it over and over again. People recognize this building because it just looks different, right? And there's a huge value to that. But, you know, the Ponte buildings may be less recognizable, but then people like architecture look at it because it's like, wow, that's like a really interesting building. It looks like a prison, so it's not very playful, but, you know. Oh, more over here, sure.
Yeah, the museum across the street is playful. I love to run up and down the stairs.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's tiled, different colors, and then you have all those picture windows.
Yeah.
So as you're going up and down the stairs, and you have all those picture windows, so that to me.
Yeah, the building works really well from the inside out. I mean, it was meant to be the way it is on the outside. It really is a prison for art, or a fortress for art. The thing is, I mean, there's infinite applications of this. The reason I picked on IKEA is because it's not obvious, right? I mean, Casa Bonita is obvious. You know, a house built upside down is obvious. You know, houses that were built, like if you go to the Meow Wolf exhibit down in Santa Fe, it's obvious, the playfulness. IKEA is less obvious, but I just think the aesthetic doesn't have to be total, you know? I mean, sometimes it's just like you go into a store and it's just like, it's been more thoughtfully laid out than the other store. You're still there to buy soap, but you're like going, oh, someone who actually understands design or beauty designed this store. You know, sometimes you go, it used to be really popular to do store windows, right? At the holidays. And those are just playful ways to invite your imagination into that. I don't know why people stopped doing that, you know? So I think it's there, it's an aesthetic. It can be big, it can be large, you know? And that's why I'm hesitant to be like, there should be more fun. I mean, you know, there probably should be at times, but it's kind of like, there should be more beauty. Yeah, but people need to eat too. I mean, these things all fit into, you know, a world that we live in. So, hey, I'm going to tell you what, I'll be around if you have more questions, but I just want to thank you all for coming and bearing with your lecture on aesthetics. So thanks.